Awesome. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Janz, City Councilor for Ward Papasteo. I'm joined by a number of advocates and neighbors and citizens here in the city of Edmonton who are concerned about housing affordability and concerned about good quality, safe, affordable homes for renters. We'll be talking about two themes this morning. One is around the need to regulate short-term rentals. The second is around how to better protect landlords and communities how to protect renters and communities through landlord licensing. Cities across North America are participating in these conversations. We see just yesterday in British Columbia, a new report came out in Vancouver citing how short-term rentals are contributing towards unaffordable housing, higher rental rates, and this is peer-reviewed research from McGill University. We're also seeing through the work that Student Legal Services and Jacob did that we'll be speaking to shortly, the need to better protect renters through business licensing in the city of Edmonton. We know that 36% of Edmontonians rent, and that safe, quality, affordable, welcoming homes for everyone is a top priority. So to start things off, I'm going to invite Jacob Holloway, from Student Legal Services to introduce the work and the new research report that they're putting out today.
Good morning. My name is Jacob Holloway, and I am a coordinator for the Legal Education and Reform Project within Student Legal Services. Student Legal Services is a legal clinic serving the low-income community in Edmonton that is run entirely by law students based out of the University of Alberta. Part of what we do in the Legal Education and Reform Project is we research gaps in law and policy and recommend potential solutions to address the issues that we've identified in our research. Today, we are proud to release the one such report on the prospect of implementing a residential rental licensing program at the municipal level. The practice of landlordism, that is buying real property and leasing it out to tenants while retaining an ownership interest, is a fundamental part of Canada's capitalist political economic system. Recent data indicates that landlordism is on the rise in Canada as the growth in renter households has more than doubled the growth of owner households from 2011 to 2021. While there have no doubt been beneficial legal reforms over the years, many of the inherently exploitative elements of this institution continue to adversely impact tenants to this day. After all, it is quite difficult to reconcile a landlord's drive to maximize profits with a tenant's basic human need for adequate shelter. However, certain programs enacted at the municipal level, such as a residential rental licensing program, have the potential to significantly improve the living conditions of tenants and provide for a more egalitarian society overall that is ultimately in line with our professed and our now codified values. Residential rental licensing is a type of program which requires landlords to register and actively maintain their rental properties in accordance with relevant health and safety standards, thus ensuring both the well-being of tenants and the quality of the municipality's housing stock. Essentially, residential rental licensing programs encourage municipalities to adopt a more business-minded approach to rental properties. The underlying logic being that since other types of business owners are required to obtain a license and regularly pass certain health and safety inspections on a regular basis, so too should landlords. The fact that landlords are in the business of renting out properties intended to become tenants' homes is all the more reason to ensure that they are indeed receiving the goods and services for which they pay and depend upon. Some of the common elements of a successful rental licensing program implemented in Canada as well as the United States include comprehensive registration systems, appropriate enforcement mechanisms, and fee structures that are focused on achieving maximum landlord compliance, as opposed to being seen as an additional revenue stream for the city. By requiring landlords to register in such a program, municipalities can then use this data to create a publicly accessible database outlining whether minimum health and safety standards are being met and providing tenants with additional resources and supports in the event that those standards are not being met. The data collected through this program could also provide local officials with the information needed to better identify problems arising from the financialization of housing, such as money laundering and affordability concerns. This data could also provide more transparency for prospective tenants, thus giving us the tools to bring Canada closer to realizing its recent declaration that adequate housing is a fundamental human right. According to our research, implementing a residential rental licensing program through the business license bylaw bears perhaps the most reasonable prospect of success, as there are already licensing requirements in Edmonton for those who provide residential rental accommodation. While there are special regulations outlining specific requirements for those who operate short-term rentals, there are no regulations for long-term rentals, despite the fact that long-term rentals are far more likely to serve as an individual's home, a place where they go to find a sense of comfort, security, dignity, and identity. Low-income individuals are far more likely to rely on rental accommodation for shelter, which can place them in an adversarial dynamic with their landlord, who, by virtue of the political and economic structures underpinning Canadian society, is incentivized to extract as much wealth from their tenants as possible. Unfortunately, this arrangement can result in significant problems ranging from the gradual dilapidation of society's housing stock to an affordability crisis that continues to spit out more tenants year after year onto the streets. While housing is a matter to be tackled by all three levels of government, municipalities are uniquely positioned to develop and implement policies and programs that can result in meaningful and material change for the better. One such program is the residential rental licensing program, which, as this report outlines, is well within the realm of possibility for the City of Edmonton. Now, I would like to conclude with a message for tenants. While it is reassuring that some of the people in power are willing to consider potential ways of addressing some of the problems arising from the housing crisis in this country, real, tangible, and meaningful solutions will not be implemented without your active participation and contribution. Reach out to tenant advocacy groups like ACORN. Contact Student Legal Services for free, plain language legal information on your rights as a tenant. And perhaps most important of all, talk to your neighbors. There is power in numbers, and the truth is there is a significant number of politicians who are invested in the status quo by virtue of being landlords themselves. There will be no significant departure from the status quo without tenants banding together and organizing for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you for doing that research. It will definitely support the upcoming debate at City Council. So the media is aware, City Council previously did pass motions requesting an unfunded service package for a landlord registry and for some of this work that Jacob and their research has undertaken. Next up is Devin Biggs. Devin is a resident, one of many residents in Ward Papasteo, who has wrote me with local concerns about Airbnbs in their neighborhood. Some of them relate to taking housing stock off the market and a concern about affordability for renters. Other concerns relate to the conduct and the challenges in enforcing and externalizing the work of upkeep and maintenance and conduct of the rentals. So, Devin, would you like to share about your family's experience?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Okay. I live in the Belgravia community with my partner Mike and our 2 cats. We moved into our house 3 years ago and discovered that our neighbor was a full-time Airbnb unit owned by someone who also owns 50 other Airbnb units across the city. In fact, they subdivided their property to rent both the main house and the basement as 2 separate units, so really we live next to 2 Airbnbs. I found out recently that the owner told our community league that they would be living in the house, so no one fought back when they wanted to knock down the old bungalow that was on the property already to build a giant duplex. Obviously, that was a lie from the beginning and really gives a sense of just how little the owners of these properties care about the communities that we live in. Over our time living in our house, we've encountered many issues with this property, including multiple parking restriction violations, garbage violations, short-term rental bylaw violations, and police being called regularly by the neighborhood on parties, problem tenants, property damage, etc. To say the situation has been bad would be an understatement. It affects the livability in our own home and our neighborhood. There is a constant feeling of invasiveness and endless disruptions living next to a property like this. Strangers arrive at all hours of the night and day. People staying there constantly use our driveway. There is no fence around their pet-friendly listing, so dogs are always coming onto our property and urinating and defecating on our plants. It took months to get the owner to clean up a pile of rotting garbage behind their house. He was only ever given warnings after weeks of investigation, and one of my complaints was even marked as not meeting bylaw offense standards, even though he was giving a warning later for that same complaint. On 2 separate occasions, guys with trucks have leaked oil all over my driveway and in front of our house. And the last time I had to call the fire department because there was so much oil it was leaking into the gutter and it was causing a fire hazard during a fire ban. I have no idea if that guy was fined or even knew the fire department showed up and cleaned up his mess. We have on multiple occasions made reports to 311 and the police with no resolutions offered up. We have been told by police there is nothing they can do. Bylaw enforcement has told us they do not pursue or enforce the few city bylaws that apply to short-term rentals. According to the City of Edmonton, the only way a homeowner can have their business license revoked is if they engage in criminal activity on the property. This means there is no accountability for the actions of the homeowners, and there is also no accountability for tenants. For example, if people rent it out to throw a party, which they've done a lot, and we make a noise complaint to the police, they will issue a warning to the tenants. This is assuming that they are able to respond to the complaint, which is honestly rare. At this point, obviously the party has already happened, and no one in the neighborhood can sleep with all the noise. The damage is done. The next time there is a party and we make a complaint, the police will once again only issue a warning. Why? Because the noise complaints are specific to the tenants, and being a short-term rental, it is constantly having new tenants. The homeowner is never involved and never issued even a warning on this. We have made dozens of noise complaints at this point, sometimes multiple nights in a row. It is obvious that short-term rentals in our city are not actually regulated, and this needs to change. Airbnb properties, like the one next door, are detrimental to our communities and negatively impact our city overall. I'm concerned that we will see even more of this type of property in the future, especially with the new zoning bylaw renewal initiative. I've not seen mention of anywhere of short-term rentals in relation to that initiative. It needs to be carefully considered and become part of the conversation. I support home sharing, but the short-term rental industry is currently the complete opposite. Wealthy individuals and companies that are making passive income at the expense of our communities are the sole beneficiaries of this system, and there are no limits to how many short-term rentals a person or company can have in the City of Edmonton. On the City of Edmonton website, it states that short-term rentals offer many benefits to Edmonton, but does not state a single benefit anywhere on the website. I can think of several benefits to banning short-term rentals, however, which include increasing the long-term rental stock, lowering housing prices overall, increasing density, revitalizing downtown, and making our communities safer. The current short-term rental model in Edmonton does not work for me, my family, or my community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing, Devin. Next up, I'd like to invite Jacob Cardinal from the Edmonton Alliance's students to talk about Edmonton Student Alliance? Yeah, there, Edmonton Student Alliance, to talk about the experiences of students across the city.
Thank you, Councillor, for that intro. Hello, Tanse everyone. My name is Jacob Cardinal, and I'm honored to speak with you today on Treaty 6 land representing the interests of my constituents. Earlier this year, I was elected as chair of the Edmonton Student Alliance, which is a nonpartisan body made up of elected representatives from students' associations and unions across the city of Edmonton. Together, we advocate on behalf of more than 100,000 college, polytechnic, undergraduate, and graduate students in Alberta's capital, and those students are who I will be speaking on behalf of. Today, I want to highlight the impact that a lack of affordable housing has had on our students in Edmonton, and to call on our municipal, provincial, and federal leaders to work together with students and institutions to build a sustainable solution. It is no secret that post-secondary students make up a large portion of renters in our city, with the first week of September kicking off a new semester and often a new lease year simultaneously. Given this background, students are also particularly vulnerable to changes in the rental housing market, especially when these changes tend toward fewer options at very high costs. Already, students across this country in cities like London, Halifax, and Charlottetown are facing housing shortages that have left some living in hotels, others living in unsafe conditions, with some students even being left homeless during their studies. For international students and Indigenous students who are moving into urban centers to complete their post-secondary education, housing is a particular priority and an additional barrier, both because of cost and availability of safe, quality options. The ESA, Edmonton Student Alliance, believes housing should not be a barrier for access. The ESA believes housing should not be a barrier for access to post-secondary education for students. Housing should be physically and financially accessible and meaningfully available for students. However, this is not the reality at the moment. There is a lack of safe, affordable, accessible housing in Edmonton, and students are suffering through unsafe housing, predatory landlords, and even homelessness in order to make it through their studies. The solution to this issue is as complex as the problem itself. And that is why we are here today, to call on our decision makers, including those who have brought us here today, to act and to do so collaboratively, following the principle of nothing about us without us. We want to ensure that as a key stakeholder, students continue to be a part of the solution building process, working and innovating alongside other leaders. We have 2 housing focuses for the year at the municipal level, which are number 1, the development of an annual post-secondary housing student survey in collaboration with student representatives, which would provide a year-by-year picture of student trends and needs in the context of housing in Edmonton. And number 2, the creation of a student housing strategy in partnership with the Edmonton Student Alliance, which would serve as a roadmap for students and the City of Edmonton on how to best leverage existing and new resources and programming to meet the housing needs of existing and future students. Students don't see the housing accessibility conversation as one where visitors and residents are in competition with one another for housing access. Rather, we look to our municipal decision makers like Councillor Janz to amplify student voices when we present solutions and to take us up on those solutions. Nanaskamal, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And next up is Brad LaFortune from Public Interest Alberta to talk about how this isn't just an Edmonton issue. This is happening across Alberta, and we hope will be front of mind in conversations about housing affordability next week at the Alberta municipalities.
Thanks, Councillor Janz, and thanks everyone else for being here today. And as Michael said, my name is Bradley LaFortune. I'm the Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta. We're a nonprofit, non-advocacy organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan. I'm here in my capacity on behalf of Public Interest Alberta, but I also sit as a fellow at the U of A Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here on Treaty 6 in Edmonton to talk about the deepening housing crisis. It's been going on for a long time, and I think it's important to say right off the bat, as we heard from Jacob and others, that housing is a human right. And as a human right, it has to do with adequacy, affordability, suitability, and other factors. It's not just a roof over people's heads. I'm not going to pull any punches here. Right now, we have a province that isn't a good enough partner with the municipalities and with the federal government when it comes to housing. Every day is a day to remind decision makers that housing is a human right, and I'm really glad to be here today to say that. What's different about this moment and this deepening crisis is that the province is essentially missing in action. They have an affordable housing strategy that is really a privatization scheme, and you only have to walk down the streets of Edmonton to see shifting encampments and sweeps to know that we're living in a deepening crisis and the province isn't doing enough. That's why I'm here today, to issue an urgent demand that Daniel Smith and the UCP government take immediate action to stop the deepening crisis from getting worse and to develop a real housing strategy that will be large enough to tackle the crisis and homelessness in Alberta. Here's a bit of a picture of where things are at as recently as August 2022, according to the city's housing needs assessment. Despite having fewer than 15,000 affordable and social housing units, we have 49,000 families in core housing need. That's 1 in 7 in Edmonton. That number is expected to grow by 2026 to 59,000 homes. Rents are skyrocketing. More than 3,000 Edmontonians are experiencing homelessness any given night right now. And we have 1,250 fewer shelter beds in this city than the city of Calgary. The deregulated and market-oriented agenda is simply not working. Unsurprisingly, a closer look at renters' data shows that people living with disabilities, people who are racialized, Indigenous individuals, and seniors are overrepresented in these current stats. Just a bit of history, a little bit. In this province in 2009, we had an affordable housing strategy that brought together hundreds of organizations, municipalities, and groups to end homelessness. And they earmarked $3 billion over several years, $3.3 billion over 10 years to build 8,000 new housing units over that time. Fast forward to now, 13 years later, and the crisis has gotten worse, not better. We applaud the work of so many people who have done so much work over so many years, who have attempted to turn the tide, but it simply has not been enough. Rather than focus on housing security and housing affordability, this current Smith government is focused on things like playing politics with our pensions and selling off our existing housing stock through their Stronger Foundations housing strategy. So, what has the UCP done on housing so far? They have refused to provide funding and mechanisms to enforce minimum shelter standards, which make folks feel more safe accessing shelters. They have quietly moved to consider the wholesale offloading of provincial housing assets through their affordable housing strategy. They've refused to review provincial legislation and implement a temporary rent freeze and eviction ban in this crisis. And they've refused to invest the necessary capital and operating dollars to turn the corner on the affordable housing crisis. Essentially, they are refusing to look the problem in the face. Housing is a cornerstone of a recovery for all. At Public Interest Alberta, it's a foundation of our mission. That's why we're demanding the UCP government immediately inject capital and operating dollars in partnership with municipalities in between budget cycles. We can't wait until the next budget cycle. In particular, we need immediate funding for shelter spaces. We are, 2 or 3 or 7 days away from freezing temperatures. People are going to, lose lives and limbs. It's a real crisis that's staring us down in the face. We need to see at least 1,250 new shelter spaces so that we're on par with the city of Calgary. And when it comes to capital expenditures, we need to build 200,000 new homes above the business case as usual, according to the CMHC, in this province by 2030. So we're falling behind, and we need real action. Instead of selling off housing assets, we should renovate and restore them, and we should build new public and social housing. And instead of ignoring the crisis and expecting the market to respond, we need massive reinvestments across the housing spectrum to build affordable housing for folks. And right now, today, we need a rent freeze, and we also need an eviction ban. Rents are skyrocketing, and people just can't keep up. In the next 6 months, we also need to see stringent definitions on what affordable is. Is it 30% of what your take home is? Is it 20% below market rate? Nobody knows. According to the province, it's, depends on who you ask. We also need to see a provincial housing needs assessment. Right now, there's a template on the website, on the GOA website, inviting municipalities to do their own. Essentially, they're offloading their responsibility. And finally, we need strong introduction of language from a human rights perspective to articulate and codify that housing is a human right and that everyone deserves safe, affordable, accessible housing. So that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, to reiterate, there's been we as a city are doing whatever we can, and as you heard from the activists, advocates, and community members today, we are trying as a city. I mean, talk about short-term rentals, talk about protecting renters, talk about regulations for landlords. Like, we are doing what we can as a city, but we need help. So we're not alone. Across Canada, there's a movement building. Across North America, actually, New York City has taken steps to curb Airbnbs. Halifax is Montreal, Vancouver right now, British Columbia is looking at provincial regulation. And I'm pleased to share a quote from one of the organizations leading the charge, Airbnb Canada. Their executive director, Thorben Wieditz, THORBENWIEDITZ, sent along a quote in support for this morning. Airbnb Canada network is pleased to see efforts commencing to rein in commercial short-term rentals in Edmonton. Homes planned, approved, and built as residential should be used for long-term tenants and not quasi-hotel inventory for platforms like Airbnb. The regulatory steps under consideration in Edmonton protect housing stock from such conversions while allowing residents to share their home with guests and tourists. This is a balanced approach and simply the only reasonable one given our housing supply shortage. So at this time, I'm happy to go to questions, and if you could direct them at which guest, that would be most helpful.
Quick question for yourself just first. You mentioned, could you just elaborate on sort of what the city is considering, like what you said something's coming up at an upcoming meeting to do with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So at March 2020, at the Community Public Services Committee, motions were passed to bring forward unfunded service packages for the fall budget consideration around the landlord licensing program that Jacob was was discussing. How could we create and maintain a landlord registry? How could we enhance enforcement? How could we better protect renters? So that's coming forward. That will be a topic for further debate, and Jacob's report really helps strengthen the case why. In terms of the Airbnbs, I'm working with my colleagues, and I don't have the exact wording, but I'm proposing to make some amendments to our business license bylaw that would see no Airbnb no short-term rental could do more than 90 days a year. So you could still use it if you're going on a trip or something. You could put your home up, but no more than 90 days a year. And secondly, a requirement for the owner to remain on the premises This would help stop some of the mega B&B listings, as Devin spoke to. It would and it stops offloading the enforcement burden onto the taxpayer and onto the community to look after somebody else's revenue stream. So these steps we've seen are being undertaken in New York and other cities, and they seem to be a very reasonable compromise, allowing short-term rentals in some occasions, and also balancing the need for housing and maintaining the housing stock. And I would add, earlier this year, many of you covered the stories we did with Canada Home Share Network. It's a program where we're trying to connect students with seniors, helping students find affordable housing in homes with seniors, and helping seniors stay in their homes longer with support from students. So, like, we're not opposed to creative solutions from the housing crisis. We're working on it. But at the end of the day, even if every short-term rental came off the market, that's only 4,400 homes. And as you heard from Brad earlier, we have 49,000 families in core housing need here. So this is a dire situation. And I think when previous councils created the short-term licensing bylaw, I think it's time to take a tweak at it and take a look a few years later. I don't think it's functioned as intended.
For Jacob Holloway, could you talk about how the licensing program works in other municipalities, and what problems would that solve in Edmonton?
Yeah, so my report, I do an in-depth look at the program in Toronto, Rent Safe Toronto, which has been around since 2017. I looked at that program mostly because it's kind of one of the oldest existing programs in Canada. It also has a lot of really promising data. So it's basically incentivizes compliance with the minimum health and safety standards by assigning a publicly viewable score to each building. I believe in Rent Safe Toronto, that program only applies to buildings with 10 or more units that are 3 or more stories. So there is a significant chunk of the tenant population in Toronto that is not covered by this program. But those that are covered, they can look up their building score. So it gives tenants a better idea of kind of the living conditions that they're in, whether or not there are any outstanding property maintenance orders, as well as kind of seeing a track record of compliance. And the data coming out of Toronto shows that the average score that buildings are receiving is going up. So it's showing that landlords are taking this seriously and improving the conditions of their buildings proactively as opposed to reactively.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but at the Student Legal Center, do you hear a lot from students about concerns with their living conditions? And if so, have you seen that increase over the last few years?
That would be more of a question for our civil project coordinator, which handles our landlord-tenant disputes. However, in my capacity as legal education and reform, we do outreaches to various organizations throughout the city that serve low income and people who have precarious housing status. And I find that is a subject that comes up a lot is the mold, pest infestations, the lack of heat, the lack of adequate running water. And the really long response times for the provincial public health officers to respond accordingly.
Maybe that's. Do you have any insights on that? Sort of how big of an issue this has become for students?
Thank you. And sorry,
I didn't get your. I forgot your name. Sorry.
Jacob Cardinal, representing the Edmonton Student Alliance. And sorry, could you reiterate the question just one time?
We had just asked about to what extent poor living conditions for student renters is that a problem? What stories are you hearing from students in that regard, and have they gotten worse over the last few years?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, the student issue is a growing issue as the lack of available proximal, clean, and affordable housing is a problem, and it is as asked, it is a growing problem for our students, and that is why we're here today, is to really just promote that that desire and need, that desperate need for students to have access to reliable, clean, affordable housing.
Do you think students would use a licensing registry, like if they could go online and check a landlord's properties, and is that something that you think would be useful?
Yeah, I look towards services like Rate My Professor, which students are using, and they do use quite a lot to really look at what is available to them as as in that and looking towards professors. But yes, I do believe that if students had that option to do the further research on who they would be renting from, I definitely think students would use it.
I have a question for Devin. If I could.
Sure.
You described a pretty concerning situation over there in Belgrade.
Indeed, yeah.
I think a lot of Edmontonians might not realize there are very many Airbnbs in Edmonton.
Yeah,
you know?
4,400 according to Michael Janz, which is more than I thought there was, actually.
Yeah. And so I guess maybe could you just sort of reiterate, like, what, you described the trash, the parties, the traffic, the oil.
Yeah, yeah.
What does that do to a person when you're trying to just live?
Well, I mean, if you get me talking about stories about nightmare stories about the Airbnb next door, we'll be here all day. The worst things I think that happened were actually at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know, well, I'm sure we all remember. The clubs and stuff closed down, and people were renting these places out to throw massive parties. And one of these happened next to us. There was about 75 people there. They had a whole huge sound system. And it was just like, what I remember from that night is just constantly hearing people opening and shutting their car doors. Like all night, just like open, shut, open, shut, open, shut. And honestly, like 3 years later, anytime I hear that happen outside, I still get that fight or flight kind of response. Like it's almost like a PTSD thing. That party shook our house. And we called the police and they did not respond to our complaint. So those people just were able to do that. There was no repercussions. Airbnb doesn't take any actions against these places because it would mean that they would lose money. So the only thing I've ever seen happen is the listings will be taken down for maybe a week, but people can still stay there if they're already booked, and then they just go back up, and things continue on as always. So.
And it seems like it really is the sort of the repetitive nature of this, coupled with lack of action from anyone in any sort of authority.
For sure. Well, and it's like living next to a hotel, but there's no security, there's no front desk person, there's no, and there's 2 units. So there's an upstairs and a downstairs. There's also no security for the people that are staying there. So just a couple weeks ago, the family staying in the upstairs called the police on the people partying in the basement, that's how loud they were. The police showed up about an hour after the party had ended, woke everyone up, banging on the door. This lady comes up, super inebriated, swearing at the police, telling them to F off, all this stuff, telling them how they should come in and do cocaine and mess with her. And after all this noise, after all this, they were just like, okay, we'll have a good night. And they left. And I was like, you guys, this is, I have the whole audio of the whole thing. I have video. This is the sort of response that we're getting too from police and bylaw. There's no sort of care about the people that actually live in the zone. It's almost like they're going out of their way to make it easy for these Airbnbs to operate, if that makes sense. A bylaw, I've complained to them. I had them tell me on the phone that they won't pursue enforcement action on certain bylaws. And when I asked them why, they said, I don't know, that's what my supervisor told me. This is where I'm at. I've been fighting this for 3 years. So it's just it's like strangers in and out all the time, people in and off and on my driveway all the time because we're the only driveway on the block. And so, it's just we're being invaded by these places. And the mentality of people that stay there is, well, we paid for this place so we can do whatever we want, right? And I literally had someone tell me that the other day when I asked them to be quiet. So, it hasn't stopped. I haven't seen any solutions. But I do think that Airbnb is on the way out. People are realizing it's not necessarily the greatest experience to stay at one of these places. They're not as cheap as they used to be. There's all sorts of hidden fees. You don't have security. You don't have room service. You don't have people cleaning your place. You may show up to the place and it hasn't been cleaned at all. You just have to look at the reviews to see all this stuff about the place next door. So, sorry, that I told you I would go on for a while.
I'm assuming you have.
Yes. So what happens with Airbnb is they say, oh, we're sorry that you're having a negative experience, and we will take appropriate actions. They never tell me what the actions are. They never tell me if they've done it or not. and the place operates. It just continues to operate. And to be fair, I've had the exact same response from bylaw and people at the city. So I don't know if there's ever been any enforcement action taken, or what that even would look like. Yeah. Is that what you meant to ask? Or is that what you're asking? Okay.
Oh, what about the owner of the property, the one who's
Yes.
renting it out through Airbnb? Have you contacted that person?
I have no idea who they are. I have seen them come drop stuff off a couple times, but I've never talked to them. And according to their Airbnb, this host has 50 listings in Edmonton. So, of course, they're not going to care about what happens at any individual one, right? So.
I got a couple questions about the sort of the rent cap, I guess, and eviction freeze stuff. What I guess there surely there would be sort of consequences for that, I guess, unintended stuff around, if there are problem tenants kind of thing, or landlords who are saying, hey, my mortgage is going up because of all these rate hikes, therefore I do need to raise the rent, I guess. What do you sort of say to those sort of concerns with sort of a proposal like that?
Yeah, specifically on the eviction freeze, or
Yeah, I guess eviction freeze.
Yeah.
Whatever's relevant in your mind.
yeah, it's a good question. I think that what we need to look at is when it comes to affordability issues and people not being able to pay their rent, then we need to find ways to make sure that people can maintain their housing, and also make sure that we keep landlords whole. But at the same time, there's different solutions. One is BC has a rent bank that people can access. So if they're in financial hardship and they can't afford to pay their rent, they can get low interest or no interest loans to be able to subsidize their rent. That's one option. I think that though the most important thing is that it's not going to be it's not going to benefit our city, our province, if people are finding themselves in housing insecurity for reasons of affordability issues. Obviously, we need to consider how people are using their housing and the impacts on neighbors, as we heard when it comes to Airbnb. But that's an important thing. On the affordability issue, in Calgary, July over July last year, rents have gone up 18%. Right, so it's like it's getting to it's not quite Vancouver territory, but it's pretty bad. Edmonton's not quite there, but it's getting there when it comes to affordability. So I think a temporary rent freeze is a really, really good idea. We're going to hear a lot from people, especially going back to I think it was 2008 now. Ed Stelmach was talking about a rent freeze and floated the idea. It went over like a lead balloon because you had Boardwalk and other REITs come out and say, you know what, we're never going to have new stock if we put in a rent freeze because we can't maximize our profits. There's also alternative points of view from economists and experts who say actually that argument is false. You can look at Acorn, Public Interest Alberta, other groups have information that actually a rent freeze doesn't impact stock or affordability in a negative way. And right now our first interest is supporting renters and making sure they have roofs over their head.
Would that have to come in at the provincial level, that sort of action?
Yeah, that would be a provincial regulation through legislation. Yeah.
And then a question for Councillor Janz.
Sure.
Would these changes impact all short-term rentals, including people who might have secondary suites on their own property?
So this would what I'm contemplating, and again I don't have the exact wording yet, but what I'm contemplating on, and you mean with the short-term rentals?
Yes.
So in my mind, these changes would affect the short-term rental stock. So that could be the Airbnbs, the VRBOs. If you're renting a secondary suite, that's a separate process entirely. Same with if you're renting a garage suite or something else. What we're talking about is the basically the ghost hotels that's set up in homes designed to be homes, but they're not. They're short-term rentals, and that's what we're trying to target. In other words, we're trying to take the problem property beside Devon and turn it into a home for 8 of Jacob's students. Just a couple of things to add as well too. This is a growing problem. According to AirDNA, which is a website that aggregates data here, the market has grown 18% last year in Edmonton. And we've heard from city administration already that half of the Airbnbs are operating without a business license. And the Airbnbs the short-term rentals are required to post their business license on the listing online, and many of them don't. So they're already not in compliance. And if these websites were good actors, they would be taking down those listings immediately or requiring proof of business license or something. They're not. The other problem here is sometimes we hear from the Airbnbs, oh, well, just inspect us. Like those are just a few bad apples, etc. Why is the Edmonton taxpayer being asked to spend more money on bylaw officers, more money on cops, more money on enforcement to pick up the pieces for a landlord who could be living out on Vancouver Island? That's simply not fair, and it's not fair to go back to the taxpayer to externalize these costs for somebody's private profit.
And does sort of that licensing idea for landlords help
Exactly
address
the same thing. If
basically all of
you
this? Like,
right now, if you go to dinner at a restaurant in the city of Edmonton, your experience is more safer, more inspected, more regulated, there's more oversight to going out for dinner than there is where you may lay your head or your loved one may lay their head for 365 days, and that is a huge problem. We know that many landlords are great. We know that many people are great with candles, but we still have laws that require smoke detectors.
and just could you for a dummy explain how the licensing thing works? It is just a kind of
so,
typical business license kind
The
of
same
thing,
the
right?
same way for your cat or dog. If you have a pet, you fill in a form. You know where it is. Same thing for the landlord licensing. You could fill it in. My goal would be, for instance, I rented an apartment a couple years ago. I moved in, and shortly after, a couple weeks in, we found that there were cockroaches. I never knew that beforehand. All the neighbors on my floor knew about them, and they said, "Oh, your landlord never told you about the cockroaches." Had I known that, I wouldn't have moved into that apartment. I had another landlord where they changed the locks on us before we had left. We wanted to come back and do additional cleaning. Had I known that, I probably wouldn't signed up with that landlord. So if there's some sort of a database where renters can have information about who they're renting from, the condition of the unit, the maintenance plan, safety schedule, etc., it's great, and it protects the good landlords because they will have more demand, more desire, more reviews. What the registry does was it would allow our limited bylaw enforcement resources to go and target the bad landlords where we're seeing the most complaints. Just this spring, I had 3 really wild stories come to my office looking for support where they were facing eviction. A woman who was visually impaired, who couldn't even see the increases that the landlord was giving them. A person with a service dog who they were going to spray the building, and he was worried about the chemicals affecting his dog. There's so many examples like this, as well as other folks where I know one example where the landlord took away the fridge, trying to get the tenant to move out so they could condoize their building. So these may be the bad actors, but this is why we create transparent, fair legislation that protects everyone. Everyone will thrive. All of our loved ones will thrive. You or someone you know is probably a renter. Don't you want them to have a safe, affordable, quality accommodation?
A little extra revenue for the city also on that.
The idea is it pays for itself. It'll save the city money in terms of fewer calls by the police out there, fewer calls to bylaw inspectors, fewer fires and other tragic events that could happen as well too. This is preventative maintenance on the part of the city that I think has happened for. It's just got out of hand. Like with the short-term rentals, I think my predecessors voted to create this program, but they didn't anticipate the burden of enforcement that would be required, and I don't think they anticipated the housing crisis either. So we're here now. It's in our lap. We got to take action. Other questions?
I think we're good.
Griffin?
All good.
Right. Thank you all so much. And yeah, I can send along Thorbin's contact info as well too. Have a great day.